I am going to start today with 2 sessions of the book of Judges. So, Judges is a very interesting book. Raise your hand if you've ever read anything in Judges, or you're familiar with the book of Judges at all. Okay, only a couple of you. Judges is not, it's not really read all that often. There's only one selection that I can think of that's read publicly, liturgically, and that is chapter 5 of Judges, which is called the Song of Deborah, which is read as the Haftarah for Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. That's in Exodus when we read in that Parashat Mishalah. Other than that, there's really no reading. Maybe there's another Haftarah, but it's not coming to the top of my head. But other than that, there's really no reading in Judges. When you think about the books of the Bible, there are lots of books in the Bible. Many of them, a certain portion of them we read. We read the Torah, of course, in its entirety year after year. So the Torah is very familiar to us. We read certain selections of the prophets as haftarot. So those are kind of familiar to the extent that we do haftarah. We don't even do haftarah. Well, we do it in the bar mitzvahs, but we don't do it in Kol Shabbat. It's for length of time, and we don't do it at the high holidays really. So Haftarah, we might know some of the selections from the prophets, and then we know some of the 5 scrolls which we read at the holidays. So we're familiar with Esther, we read it at Purim. We're a little familiar probably with Song of Songs, which we read at Pesach, Kohelet at Sukkot. Lamentations at Tisha B'Av, Ruth at Shavuot, although we don't do a lot of public reading in our particular congregation in any of those except for Esther. And then we have other books of the Bible that really are not read liturgically. So it's an interesting thing to think about that we have this whole Bible, and but a lot of it is not known to us simply because we don't read it. The liturgical reading set by the sages for the various times, the Torah reading, the Haftarot, the 5 scrolls at the various holidays, comes to ensure that those books remain known and accessible to the people. When a book is not set for public reading, it kind of exists on paper, but unless we read it, it's almost like the book doesn't exist. We have kind of like a canon within the canon. A canon is a set kind of body of literature that is recognized and read by a community. We have a canon within the canon. That's established by the sages in terms of what we read publicly. The rest of it is there, but kind of like it's not there. And I would say that the book of Judges falls into that latter category. It's here in the book, in the Tanakh, but we don't read it publicly. So to what extent is it really part of our consciousness? Probably not very much. That's why when I asked you, how many of you have read in the book of Judges, only 2 of you raised your hands. And that's not unexpected because we just don't have occasions for reading. So we're going to do some reading in the book of Judges. It's really a very interesting book. It's a very dark kind of book. It's got kind of a dark humor to it when you read it kind of through that lens, and that's what we're going to do. It's satirical. It presents itself as a historiography, which is an account of the history of the Jewish people in a particular time period. That's true of these first several books within the second section of the Tanakh, the prophets, Judges is within the section of the prophets. But it's not like Isaiah or Ezekiel where these, it's prophecies, really. It's historiography. We find that in the book of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are the first five or six books of the section on prophets, but they're historiographies. Okay, and that's how Judges presents itself. But that said, it's important to understand that when we read biblical historiography, like any historiography, this is true of all historiography, that historiography, the telling of history, is always ideologically motivated. There is no such thing as a non-ideological historian. There's really no such thing as non-ideological writing. I mean, that's true of everything. The specter of, pure objectivity is an illusion. That's not how the world works. Because any writer writes from a particular context and time, is influenced by certain events and, in his or her own life and the life of the community, and comes to it consciously or not with a particular perspective on the world. And that cannot help but come through in the way he or she writes, and in the way the writer writes history, in our case specifically. So the book of Judges is a historiography that has an ideology. In Judges, the ideology is really heavy. I mean, it's quite explicit when you know, and it becomes readily apparent when you know what you're looking for. So part of what we're going to do, the way that we're going to start our study of Judges, is to look at the ideology of the book. And we'll be able to see it, as I say, very quickly and very readily when we approach it that way. And then understanding the ideology of the book will help us in understanding the narratives that we read. But as an ideological historiography, Judges, like all the historiographical books in the Tanakh, are kind of composite works of literature. There are different layers to it. And we're going to divide our reading of Judges into trying to identify two basic layers. Well, actually three basic layers. One we're going to call, I'm just going to make this up. Let's see. Historical redaction. One we're going to call ideological overlay. And one we're going to call core narrative. Okay. Those are kind of the three strata of the book that we're going to identify. All right, so before we go any further, let's say our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let's open up the Judges without further delay. In the brown JPS, it's on page 513. If you have another volume, maybe somebody can call it out in the green volume. What page?
377.
377? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the book of Judges, in Hebrew it's called Shoftim. According to this book, and to biblical history in general, the Shoftim, or the judges, were the rulers of the people in the land of Israel between the time of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy. Okay? So in terms of history, we have, of course, the Torah, heading toward the promised land, led by Moses, right? Moses doesn't go into the promised land. He's not allowed. Joshua takes over leadership of the community and leads the people into the land to conquer the land from the 7 nations who live there, right? So Joshua is the general who wins all the battles and so forth and kind of establishes the community there. And he's the leader of the community until he dies. Then we have the period of the judges. They're called shoftim, so it is translated as judges because that word is related to mishpat. It's the same root in the Torah, which talks about law and statutes and so forth. But a lot of times when we read the book of Judges, they translate the word shofet or shoftim as chieftains as opposed to judges, because they're not judges in the sense that we think of it like sitting on a court and hearing cases. They're more like tribal chiefs. Okay? So the tribal chiefs rule for a long period of time. I don't know exactly how many years. It's all recounted here. And then after the period of the judges, a new form of government is introduced. That's the establishment of the monarchy. That's with Saul was the first one, and then David, and Solomon the second one. Okay? So that's situationally in history where we are in Judges. We know that, though, because of this first kind of stratum of the literature, the historical redaction. So let me show you how that works. At the end of Joshua, we're told the story of Joshua. So actually, flip back a few pages. Flip back to the previous page, at the end of the book of Joshua. Okay, at the end of the book of Joshua, in chapter 24, let's look at verses 28 through 31. It says, Joshua, so we're on page 511. Joshua then dismissed the people to their allotted portions. After these events, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him on his own property at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the elders who lived on after Joshua and who had experienced all the deeds that the Lord had wrought for Israel. Okay, and then we just get a little bit more about the bones of Joseph. But that's the end of the Joshua story. Now, if we turn into Judges, Judges begins by saying, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, which of us shall be the first to go up against the Canaanites and attack them? And then we have this whole long chapter 1, just kind of going through these various battles and such that happen. And then if you flip to chapter 2, verse 6, so it's on page 516, chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites went to their allotted territories and took possession of the land. The people served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the older people who lived on after Joshua and who had witnessed all the marvelous deeds that the Lord had wrought for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years and was buried in his own property at Timnath-Heresh in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And all that generation were likewise gathered to their fathers. Okay. Anything strike you about that passage? It's the very same thing, or virtually identical, right? So when you see something like that in the Tanakh, okay, this is good indication, according to critical readers of the Bible. This is good indication that what comes, when you have like a first clause that looks like that and a second clause that looks identical, it creates like an envelope, right? And then what comes in between is generally seen to be some kind of material inserted in order to link the two, right? So here you have the end of Joshua, right? And then you have the beginning of Judges. And you have that clause that's kind of the same, right? That strategy is used all over the place throughout the Bible. This is called a resumptive clause. When it goes back to what was said before, it tells you this is like a break in the story. And the resumptive clause is used to weave this back into what comes before. And all of this stuff in the middle is kind of the redactional material. If you think about an editor who has lots of different books, lots of different stories and material in front of them, and is trying to weave it all together in a way that makes sense, these are tools that the editor uses in order to create a composite. So it raises the kind of question about, why is the Bible in the order that it's in? Why are these various books here in the way that they are? We shouldn't think of it as one kind of unified work, written from start to finish. That's the classical view of it, but critical scholarship kind of says that we shouldn't look at it that way, that it's rather a collection of different literatures and stories over the course of time, woven together by an editor or a series of editors who kind of all make it work. The stories in Judges that we're going to read don't necessarily bear any relation themselves to the book of Joshua. But the way it's put together makes it flow, right? By utilizing this strategy of the resumptive clause and putting all this stuff in here, which we're not going to read, but it just situates it historically within, it's right after Joshua, right? So that by the time you start reading the stories of the Judges, you understand in your mind when it happened, or when you should think that it happened. Doesn't necessarily mean that it did. I mean, each of these judges that we're going to read about is kind of like a standalone story about what might just be legends in the mindset in the culture, tales about folk heroes, etc. But they're woven. Even the story of each individual judge bears no relationship necessarily to the others, but they're woven together by using this kind of redactional historical material to make it flow, to make it seem like a continuous narrative. We'll see how some of that works. I'm going to illustrate. Okay? But you can see how continuity is created with the book of Joshua by utilizing the resumptive clause strategy. It's the very same language in order to tie it back in and create the envelope for everything that's here in the middle. Okay? To illustrate that further, look at go into Judges chapter 1, verse 12, which is on page 514. This is in part of this historical redactional material that's in between the envelope, right? And it says here in verse 12, and Caleb announced, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. His younger kinsman, Othniel the Kenizzite, captured it. And Caleb gave him his daughter Achsah in marriage. This is just in the kind of series. Now, hold your finger there and flip back to Joshua chapter 15. And look at verse 15. That is, actually 16, page 490. And Caleb announced, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. His kinsman Othniel the Kenizzite captured it, and Caleb gave him his daughter Achsah in marriage. It's the very same thing, right? So again, these kinds of literary tactics are used in order to tie one of these books to the other, so that when you read it continuously, it all makes sense, that they're connected. But we should understand that that's editorial material. It doesn't mean that the core stories have anything to do with each other necessarily. This is how an editor makes it all work together. Okay, and evidence of it is here. You see it, it's very clear. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you about kind of situating it historically. Now, one other point about we're going to segue into ideology. Yeah, Steve.
Why do they need to do that? Why can't they just say, "Here's one book, is it?"
Well, because we're creating what is a whole. We're creating this book. If it's just a collection of things that don't have anything to do with each other, it doesn't make sense so much when you read it as if it's narrative. Also, this is an enterprise of kind of creating a history of the people. You know, and it's not something that's only unique to the Bible. I mean, this is just the work of communities in terms of how we tell our story. You know, what do you include? What do you not include? How do you connect one set of events to another, and so such that they make sense in light of each other? I mean, there are theorists of history who talk about. There's this one writer in particular. His name is Hayden White. He talks about how that history, or events, the way the world unfolds, is merely a collection of individual data points, infinite. I mean, numberless data points. There's nothing that intrinsically relates one data point to another. When we tell history, the act of writing history or telling history is an interpretive act which links one data point to another. Okay? So when we say that, I don't know, somebody give me examples from history, something that caused something else in history.
Emancipation Proclamation.
And what and the relation, Emancipation Proclamation and what?
And what followed there was the secession of the South from the Union.
Okay.
In
All right.
opposition to.
Okay, all right. So when someone writes a history of the Civil War era and says that Lincoln did this, then the South responded by doing that, then such and such happened, that's an interpretive act. That's interpreting why things happened and what caused. There's nothing intrinsic in the fabric of the world that says that X caused Y or not. That's how we make meaning of history. Right? So that's why anytime you read a history of anything, I said it's ideological before because it's interpretive. You know, the writer says this caused that. Okay, well that's how he or she sees it, and you can make a good case for it. But another writer can come along and offer a different interpretation. Who's right? Who's wrong? History is not a science. History is an art. Okay, it's all interpretation. So what's happening here in the Bible is, is a writer of history, or various writers of history, kind of coming together to tell the story of the people.
And who would that writer
Why
be?
did this happen?
And who and when would that writer be?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's so many different theories
The
about
monarchy?
Maybe it's during the period of the monarchy. So, some scholars say that all of it was written during the period of the monarchy to to tell a story, like tell how we got here, and that my Bible professor in HUC, believed that, and he wrote, he said that the Torah. He saw the Torah even later. He saw the Torah as having been written during the period of the Babylonian exile.
5 books?
Yeah.
Or-
That the Torah, and that the writing of the Torah would come later than the events described in the books of Kings. You see, that's another thing about, it's interpretive about the Bible. The books are placed in a particular order. But the placing of books in an order is itself an interpretive act and an ideological act. Just because the book of Kings comes after the book of Genesis in the book, doesn't mean that the book of Kings was written after the book of Genesis. Right? That whoever it is that put this is just a work of literature. Right? It's somebody put it together in the way that we have it. And that doesn't mean that we should take it at its face value any more than when I started learning about this in school, as I was relating it to what I was doing before I went to rabbinic schools, which was working as a press secretary, in politics. And I immediately thought about how the news is compiled. So each day, the newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, is put together in a paper, and it's given to you. And you look at it and you read it and you look at the front page and it's got a big, huge headline. And okay, so that tells you this is the most important thing that happened yesterday. But you have to, of course, stop to think that, well, somebody decided that that's the most important thing that happened. The editor said, let's put this on the front page. Let's put this on page 14. And when you put this on the front page, and this story on page 14, you're telling your reader, the front page event is more important than the one on 14, but that's interpretive. It's totally subjective. And that means nothing other than how the editor wants you to understand the news. Right? Then when you look inside a story, okay, you can read it by saying, well, it says this, and then you can be like, oh, that's what happened. But you have to stop and think that, well, a reporter wrote the story. Why did the reporter put such and such in the lead paragraph and such in paragraph 9? Why did the reporter choose to quote this source, but not this other person who's involved in the events? Well, all of those things go into the making of the news. The story that you read in the paper is not, you can't just say, well, that's what happened. That's how the reporter and the editors of the paper want you to understand what happened. And no more. That's it. That's all that it is. Every time we read history or news or description of events or anything, it is nothing more than how the writer wants us to perceive events. Period. And the same thing is happening here in the Bible. Why is the Bible set up the way that it is? Why are the stories told? Because whoever put it together, that's how they want us to understand it. Now the classical tradition says the writer is God, or at least for the Torah, so that's how God wants us to understand it, and then it's real, it's absolute truth. But once we move away from that and say that it's the work of human hands, then hey, it's the work of human hands. Right? Okay, so that's, Paula.
How do the Orthodox view the theory of interpretation? From your perspective.
What do you mean, the theory of interpretation?
They don't.
Interpreting as opposed to factual. Accepting.
Well, Judaism is a highly interpretive tradition. We are nothing if not interpreters. The rabbis of the Talmud are nothing if not interpreters. So, interpretation is central to Judaism. And no Jew today, really of any stripe, reads the Bible without the aid of the interpretations of the tradition. That's why when you look at whether it's a Talmud or a Bible or anything else in a classical Jewish text, the page is set up like this. You have the primary text in the middle, and you have all kinds of commentaries and interpretations around it. Because to study Jewish text is to engage in the enterprise of interpretation. Now, there are different ways of interpreting, different strategies of interpreting. So, Orthodox Jews might employ different interpretive strategies than Reformed Jews do. But interpretation is central to all Jewish approaches to reading text.
But when they say the Torah says, do this, and this is how you do it,
You can't say that because the
Don't-
Torah says,
don't somebody.
that's right, the Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 21, if a man who has a stubborn and rebellious son must bring him to the city gate and stone him to death. Nobody would tell you, no, even the most Haredi black hat Jew in the world would tell you that if you have a stubborn and rebellious son that you do that. The reason that they would not tell you that is because the Talmud already reinterprets that passage to say that, to explain why it is no longer operative. So it's too simplistic to say that that Orthodox Jews or fundamentalist Jews look at the Torah and just say the Torah says do that, and so that's it. That's not how Jews read the text. Nobody does. Now, Christian fundamentalists might read the text that way, but no one in the Jewish world, with the exception of the sect called the Karaites, who basically don't exist anymore, except for maybe a few people here and there, read the text that way. The text is always subject to interpretation. Okay? All right. So that's what I wanted to show about historical situation. Now I'm going to segue into ideology. So to help us understand the aims of the writer of Judges, or the editor or editors of Judges, we need to look in a couple places, again, where we're going to see a little trope, or a phrase that's repeated often in this book. So flip forward to Judges to chapter 17, verse 6. Remember, this is the period, it's now situated us in the period of history after the death of Joshua, but before the establishment of the monarchy. So if you look at chapter 17, verse 6, page 5, 57.
or 408.
Okay, or 408. You see in verse 6 it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did as he pleased." Okay, you see that? Now turn and look at chapter 18, verse 1. "In those days there was no king in Israel." And it goes on to tell it. "And the tribe of Dan was seeking a territory in which to settle. For to that day no territory had fallen to their lot." Flip to chapter 19, verse 1. "In those days when there was no king in Israel, a Levite residing at the other end of the hill country took himself a concubine," etc. It goes into the story. Flip forward to chapter 21, verse 25 at the end of the book. This is the last verse in the book, page 569. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased." Okay? Now when you see the recurrence of this, what's the point? Why does this keep being repeated?
That's where we need a king.
Okay, right?
Right. We need a
Okay.
king.
So the author of this book is telling us, and it's pretty clear. When you're attuned to kind of picking up, reading it, picking up the tropes, that the editor is telling us that we need a king. That having no king is bad because everybody does as they please and it's chaos. And then when we start reading the stories of the judges, we're going to see that. Okay. That it's chaos, and the stories are very dark, and it's clear that the writer doesn't think highly of the judges and such, and this form of government, and wants a monarchy. And then, okay, in the next books, you're going to get it. Okay? So I'm just trying to draw your attention to some of these things to help you see how history is told here in the Bible. and with an ideologically driven agenda. Okay? All right. Now, let's go back to chapter 2 in Judges. So now we're going to move into this kind of second layer. We already did that a little bit with the thing about the king. Ideological overlay. So think about now where we're moving. Well, we can think about this book, as I've been describing it, as like an onion. And we use the metaphor of onions, you know, in talking about telling stories, because we say like peeling back the onion, right? So think of this as an onion. There's a core, but it's covered up by all the layers of the onion. And in order to get to the core, you have to first peel back the onion. So we started that with understanding the material that situates us within a particular time in history. Peel that back. The second thing is what I call the ideological overlay here. Because on top of the core stories, you have this framework that the narrator creates. Again, using recurring language, recurring motifs and such, to situate the core stories within a broader setting, so that each time you read each little story, sub-story you read, it makes sense in light of the bigger framework. Okay? In order to do that, the author of Judges sets up uses this ideological overlay, which he introduces at the beginning in chapter 2. He's not subtle about it. You just have to know to look for it. Okay? He introduces it, and it's a view of history, how history works, why it unfolds the way that it does. Okay? Let's look at chapter 2, starting with verse 11.
Starting with what?
I just noticed a difference in translation, where your translation says an angel, mine says an emissary.
Where are you in the Samson story?
No, Judges.
Oh, an angel.
verse
Oh, an
1.
angel of the Lord.
And
Mala.
there's a footnote, but
Oh,
saying.
yeah.
You know, it's the same word you use.
it could be-
Mala.
Yeah.
Yeah, angel means
Interesting, a messenger of the
Yeah,
Lord.
messenger. Right. Okay, but I want us to look at chapter 2. Remember, we read verses 6 through 10. That was the resumptive clause tying us to Joshua. Right? Now pick up with 11, because right after tying us back to Joshua and setting us in the historical context, the editor introduces the ideological overlay. And here's how it goes. And the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They worshipped the Baalim and forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples around them and bowed down to them. They provoked the Lord. They forsook the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Ashtaroth. Then the Lord was incensed at Israel, and he handed them over to foes who plundered them. He surrendered them to their enemies on all sides, and they could no longer hold their own against their enemies. In all their campaigns, the hand of the Lord was against them to their undoing, as the Lord had declared and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in great distress. The Lord raised up chieftains, that's Shoftim, who delivered them from those who plundered them. But they did not heed their chieftains either. They went astray after other gods and bowed down to them. They were quick to turn aside from the way their fathers had followed, in obedience to the commandments of the Lord. They did not do right. When the Lord raised up chieftains for them, the Lord would be with the chieftain and would save them from their enemies during the chieftain's lifetime. The Lord would be moved to pity by their moanings because of those who oppressed and crushed them. But when the chieftain died, they would again act basely, even more than the preceding generation, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They omitted none of their practices and stubborn ways. All right? This sets the ideological table for how the book of Judges is going to go. What is the writer telling us about history during this period. Joe?
That because, that as soon, anything that the Israelites lost, the battle they lost is because of God being against them.
Okay, right. That's right. So they lose their battles. God is against them, so they're going to lose. Okay? That God intervenes in history in that way. What else?
It's about idolatry.
Yeah, okay.
Well,
So they
God doesn't like it if you go to other gods.
Right.
God's the only God.
so they committed lots of idolatry during
that's
this
the big
time.
sin, is
Yeah,
idolatry.
right. Art?
When they conquered the land of Israel, they really didn't get rid of everybody that was there. You know, I always thought when I was a kid, oh, they totally just, except for the Philistines, took over.
Yeah.
But from this, it says that there were still people living there
Still,
who
yeah.
did worship God.
Yeah, good.
Contagious.
Okay, what else? No?
Is it pointing to the kings by saying under chieftains they were better than without chieftains?
Yeah, the chieftain, well, they're not, the chieftain is not a king, but the chieftain is a,
Leading to the-
yeah, is the shofet. But yeah, under the shoftim, whenever there was a shofet that arose like this, then things were good. You know, it was good. But once the chieftain died, they went bad again. Right? So it was erratic. There wasn't continuous leadership in the way, and that's part of the case for the king, which is you have to have a monarchy so that there's always a leader to keep people in line. Because without it, there's no king. Everyone does as he pleases. That's what the author tells us lots of times. Okay? Right. So God appoints a chieftain, a shofet. He leads them. And what does the chieftain do for them? Leads them in battle against their enemies, and they win, right?
Yes, because God's with them.
Because God's with them, right? And God's with the shofet, the chieftain. Okay? And then the chieftain dies, and they revert back, right? And as you can see from the way it's set up, it's a cycle, right? It's a cycle. And this cycle, this is the template. The whole book of Judges is about this cycle repeating itself over and over again. That's the whole book. Okay? So there's a writer in the book of Judges whose name is Yahira Amit, who identifies this pattern in 5 stages, which I think is very good, helps us make sense of it. The cycle has 5 stages. Let me just make sure I get it right. Yeah, okay. The first stage is sin. Okay, the people commit idolatry. They forsake the Lord. Incidentally, remember what we read at the end of Joshua, and in the resumptive clause here is, during the time of Joshua, the people served the Lord. That's what it said. It's only after Joshua dies that they start committing idolatry. Okay? But they served the Lord under Joshua, but then he dies and they sin. That's the first stage. The second stage is punishment. Okay? So they commit idolatry, God punishes them. How does God punish them?
Our enemies.
Okay, the enemies rise up and oppress them. Okay? So it tells you that the sin is against God. The punishment is brought by God. This is a history, an ideology of history, wherein God is a very active player. Everything unfolds because of God. That's biblical ideology of history.
So when anything bad happens, you
It's
deserve
because
it.
God
You
did it.
deserved it.
You did right. Okay, this is the Bible's ideology of history, and it's made very clear here in Judges. Okay, the next stage is the people cry out to God. Okay, and it's alluded to here. They're moaning under the weight of it. So they cry out to God, and then in response, what does God do? Appoints the chieftain, right? And the chieftain leads them into battle and saves them from their enemies. So Amit's 4th stage is liberation.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
So when they cry out to God, does that mean that they abandon the idols? They go back?
Yeah, they're like, this is horrible, we're under our enemies. Yeah, they cry out to God, and abandon the idols, and this chieftain leads them in battle. They conquer their enemies. And then after the liberation, what happens? Before it starts over, does it? I don't know if it says it. It does. Well, it may not say it explicitly here. We'll see it. It does say it explicitly elsewhere. The fifth stage is peace. Okay? So under the chieftain, he wins the battle. Then there's peace in the land. For a period of time, everything is good. Then the chieftain dies, and the whole thing starts all over again. Okay? That's the template. Now I want to show how that plays out. Now, the editor of Judges is very overt in terms of how he presents the ideology. If you're looking for it, you can see it. So then he segues into the first story. Turn to chapter 3. So the story of kind of the first judge. Chapter 3, let's start with verse 7. Or just verse 5. You can kind of see the beginning. The Israelites settled among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters to wife and gave their own daughters to their sons, and they worshipped their gods. The Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They ignored the Lord, their God, and worshipped the Baalim and the Asherot. The Lord became incensed at Israel and surrendered them to King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites were subject to Cushan-Rishathaim for 8 years. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised a champion for the Israelites to deliver them. Othniel the Kenizzite, a younger kinsman of Caleb. He was the guy that was in Joshua, right? He's all bringing it all in. This is the historical thing. The Spirit of the Lord descended upon him, and he became Israel's chieftain. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram into his hands. He prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim, and the land had peace for 40 years. And then you see, when he died, the Israelites did again what was offensive to the Lord. See, you see the cycle. The first story. So the editor of this text is kind of making this like a kid's book. I mean, it's very simple. He tells us when it happened, then he goes in and says, this is the general way things happen. Then he says, let me show you how this is exactly the way things happen. And the first story follows the 5-stage pattern exactly. Right? It's very short and concise. It just goes boom, 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 boom. Right? Now look at how at this little story and how it kind of utilizes. We think about this. I said it's like a kid's book. Okay, telling you what's going to happen, illustrating it. It's a little bit like what you would expect, what you would read in a kid's story, a fairy tale of some kind. The villain here is called Cushan-Rishathaim. And where is he from? Aram Naharaim. Okay, so look, it's rhyming. It's like King Cushan-Rishathaim from Aram Naharaim. Right? It's like, okay. Now his name, Cushan. What do we? Cushan is the first name. So Cush, what does that mean? Yeah, it's dark, black. Okay, so Moses married the Cushite woman. Cush is the idea of black. Okay, and Rishathaim. Let's think about this grammatically. What is Rasha?
Oh, the evil.
Evil. All right, and when you have in Hebrew the word when you say like pa'amayim,
Double.
it's doubled, right? Okay, so pa'amayim, pa'am is once, and pa'amayim is twice. Okay, so that when you utilize that suffix, here you have Rasha doubled. So how would you translate the king's name?
Squared.
No, he's Cushan Rishathaim. So he's translated. We translated it already.
Evil, dark one.
Black.
Double.
Black double wickedness.
Double. Right.
Right? Black double wickedness. That's his name. Okay? So look, I mean, this is literature. It's like a fairy tale. Okay? The king black double wickedness. They did bad things, and then they were punished by being subject to king black double wickedness. From the place that rhymes with his name. I mean, it's a story, okay? To illustrate how history works. Now, so we read the story of Othniel, this first judge. He saves the day. It's great. He saves us from black double wickedness. And it's all good. Now we're starting to get it. So now the narrator is going to go into more complex stories. But what you're going to see as the stories unfold is that they all follow the same pattern. And really, the part that becomes elaborated is this one. The liberation part. This is the story of the judge. Okay? And it's really this part. Once you peel back the onion, you see that it's this stage that is the core story. Okay? And the rest of it, it's built into this broader ideological framework. So we read about all these different judges. The first one we're going to read about is Ehud. Okay? Ehud's story is told within this broader framework. But as we read Ehud's story, we want to keep in mind how it's constructed. Now we know, because we've seen it, the editor's very clear about it, that all of this is the meta story, the framework that it's plugged into, right? How he wants us to understand the story of Ehud. Knowing that, we can peel some of this back, peel the onion back, and look at the story of Ehud, the core story of Ehud on its own. And then we'll be able to ask, what is Ehud about? Who is this guy? Just when the core story is told. And how does the ideological overlay influence the way that we read his story? Okay, those are the questions that we're going to explore. So, before we move into Ehud, any questions about what we're doing so far?
And the question is just an observation that should probably be obvious. And that is that this is no different than any other work of fiction, certainly historical fiction.
Yeah.
And you speak of it as a template for this book of Judges. It's really almost a template for any kind of historical fiction. They all have to go through certain stages that are in order to get to their point, whatever their point is.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it
And to borrow the Hayden White, of the data points, what the author is doing here is taking given data points, maybe a legend or story about some hero named Ehud out there. I'm not even want to use the term hero because that's an ideological statement about how to understand him. But some guy out there in the culture about Ehud did such and such, and everybody knows who Ehud is. The author of Judges takes the story of Ehud, this data point, and plugs it into this framework that tells us how to understand him, make sense of his story. Yeah, that's what it is.
and the reader,
Whether it's fiction or nonfiction,
Right.
that's what always has happened.
and the reader must read, just as one reads the daily newspaper, with a critical eye.
Exactly.
And if we don't question what we're reading, then we're just like suckers.
Right, exactly. That's right. You're just going along with how the editor wants you to understand things. My teacher of this material had a mantra. He said, resist the redactor. Okay? And that's just true. Just when anything you read critically. Understand what the author and the editor is doing with the material and how they're guiding you to understand it. And then resist it, because when you resist it, it's not that they don't have anything valuable to say as the editor. They do. But when you resist it, you can understand what they're saying, and you can also understand more. Because you can start asking questions about, why are they wanting us to understand it this way? What's not here? It opens the door to a fuller understanding of literature. Okay? And same thing when you read the newspaper. If you just read it and take it at face value, you're getting what the editor wants you to get from the news, and that's valuable. But you're missing tons. everything that's between the lines. Okay? So, Paul?
As the Israelites see what God has been doing for them, why do they keep resorting back to idolatry? Why do they keep this cycle?
Because they never learn. I mean,
Right,
that's kind of the thing. I mean, look, it happened in the wilderness too. I mean, they keep complaining and saying, let's go back to Egypt, and and then God does a miracle for them, and then they're happy for a while, then they forget about it, and they keep complaining. I mean, this is a pattern throughout the Bible, where human beings have short memories, and we keep, we never learn. And the way the author of the story is telling us is that just repeats. Even when we get into the land, it keeps happening that way. And he's using that in order to make the case for a king. Because if we have a king who's a pillar of piety and good behavior, and his leadership is uninterrupted, or the monarchy's leadership is uninterrupted, and it's not just these chieftains who come about now and then that provide strong leadership for the people, then maybe we have a chance. But the pattern he tells us is every time one of these guys dies, they just go back, because they never learn. Right? Again, that's an interpretive view of history. All right, so let's move into the story of Ehud. Okay, so no, he's in chapter 3. Ehud.
15.
Verse 15.
Yeah, verse 15.
Yeah. No, before that. It's verse 11. The second half of verse 11. He prevailed over Cush on Rishatayim, and the land had peace for 40 years. Right, now we go right into the story of Ehud. When Othniel the Kenizzite died, the Israelites again did what was offensive to the Lord. And because they did what was offensive to the Lord let King Eglon of Moab prevail over Israel. Eglon brought the Ammonites and the Amalekites together under his command and went and defeated Israel and occupied the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a champion for them, the Benjaminite Ehud, a son of Gera, a left-handed man. We're going to go back to this. I want to read the whole story. We'll go back to the left-handed man in a minute. It happened that the Israelites sent tribute to King Eglon of Moab through him. So Ehud made for himself a two-edged dagger, a gomed in length, which he girded on his right side under his cloak. He presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very stout man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had conveyed the tribute. But he himself returned from Pisilim near Gilgal and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." Eglon thereupon commanded, "Silence!" So all those in attendance left his presence. And when Ehud approached him, he was sitting alone in his cool upper chamber. Ehud said, "I have a message for you from God." Whereupon he rose from his seat. Reaching with his left hand, Ehud drew the dagger from his right side and drove it into Eglon's belly. The fat closed over the blade, and the hilt went in after the blade, for he did not pull the dagger out of his belly, and the filth came out. Stepping out into the vestibule, Ehud shut the doors of the upper chamber on him and locked them. After he left, the courtiers returned. When they saw that the doors of the upper chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. Now you understand what the cool upper chamber is, right? They waited a long time, and when he did not open the doors of the chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there their master was lying dead on the floor. But Ehud had made good his escape while they delayed. He had passed the Pisilim and escaped to Seirah. When he got there, he had the ram's horn sounded through the hill country of Ephraim, and all the Israelites descended with him from the hill country, and he took the lead. "Follow me closely," he said, "for the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." They followed him down and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites. They let no one cross. On that occasion they slew about 10,000 Moabites. They were all robust and brave men, yet none of them escaped. On that day Moab submitted to Israel, and the land was tranquil for 80 years. Okay, that's the end of the Ehud story. Now you see, it follows the same pattern, but the liberation section is elaborated, right? The core story of Ehud is told in that stage. So now that we know a little bit about ideological overlay, peeling back the onion, let's go back through this, and you tell me, where's the core story of Ehud and where's the ideological overlay? What do we have to remove in order to get to the core story of Ehud? Remember, the story started with verse 11. Phyllis?
I don't know if this answers your question, but it sounds like a lot of David's stuff. Ehud being a Benjamite triggers it to me that it's
Okay.
David. The king of Moab,
Yeah.
Moab being the ancestor of Ruth, who's the ancestor of David. So there's a lot of, and then how he tricks him and kills
Yeah.
him. It almost sounds like Goliath. He's a very obese man. Goliath is a very tall man.
Yeah.
But even so, there seems to be hints of David.
Good. Okay, maybe so. Maybe so. But let's focus on where is the ideological overlay and where is the core story? How do we peel it back?
God was with them.
Okay, but let's be specific about verses. The story of Ehud starts in 11. At what point do we get to the core story?
Chapter number, verse 15.
Verse 15, then the Israelites cried out to the Lord. But I think that's part of the ideological overlay, right? Because the ideology is always, they sin, they're punished, Israel cries out, God raises up a champion. That's all the overlay, right? We can peel that away from the story of Ehud. That's not specifically related to the story of Ehud. That's the framework, right? So when do we get to the story of Ehud?
When he makes
I
his
think
sword.
with Ehud, with Ehud, I think it's 16.
16.
That's
Yeah.
where the meat of it is.
Yeah, that's the meat, right? So verses 16 through to 22. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Isn't it 20 when he says, I have a message for you from God?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think so, because remember the ideological overlay is a general liberation. That's part of it. The fourth part of it is the general liberation, and the core story is the content of the liberation. The overlay is the pattern, and all the material that produces the pattern. So you have, they sinned, they were delivered into the hands of this Moabite king, and he gathered the Amalekites and everything against him. They cried out, da, da, da. Then you have Ehud, and he's going to come and liberate. Then there's peace in it. Okay? So I think it goes through at least 22. I mean, it maybe go a little further. I mean, the content of the liberation still goes through 29. And then 30 is really that's the ideology, that there's peace after it, right? So I want to focus in then on verses 16 through 29. That's the core story of Ehud. Now before we look at the core story of Ehud, what is this book telling us about, how are we supposed to understand Ehud as a character? How does he get his job?
God appoints.
God appoints him, okay? All right, so what else are we supposed to understand about Ehud?
His, father was
Left-handedness is.
Yeah, well, the left-handedness we got to get to.
That's
We'll
just- yeah.
dissect that a little more closely. What else are we supposed to understand about him? Given that he's appointed by God, what does that mean?
Well, he seems to then take charge of himself and of the situation.
Takes charge of the situation, okay? So he's kind of, He's a leader. He's
Military.
a military leader. You might say that he's kind of heroic. I mean, he takes charge of the whole thing. He saves the people, right? And he's an emissary of God. That's how the overlay wants us to read him. But now we got to go back and look at him without the overlay. All right? So Ehud, you have to go back into 15 where he's introduced. The Benjaminite, Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man. Now let's look closely at that. And you have to look at the Hebrew in order to get it.
Now, who's the left-handed man, he or
Ehud.
his father?
Ehud is. Okay? So he's if you look at verse 15, the third line of the Hebrew there is Ben Hayamini. That's a Benjaminite. But Benjamin means Ben Yamin, which means what?
Son of my
Son of my right hand.
Son of my right hand.
Okay? All right, so the Benjamin is the name of the tribe, but it means son of my right hand. Okay? It indicates strength of the right hand somehow or another. Now, Ehud is Ben Hayamini, Ish Iter Yad Yamino. Okay? Iter means closed up or like not blocked.
My translation says a withered right hand.
A withered, okay? So they translated JPS as a Benjaminite, a left-handed man. And when you read the English translation, you get no sense of the irony of the literature, right? He's Ben Hayamini, Ish Iter Yad Yamino. He's a man of the right-handed tribe whose right hand is withered. What is that telling us about Ehud?
He's
different than all the rest.
Physical,
Okay, well, he's got a defect.
which,
somehow.
right, which
But
could limit
there's
him.
more. It's okay, but it could limit. But that would be true even if he was a Judahite or a Danite. The fact that he's a Benjaminite, there's more. There's more irony to it. He's a man of the right hand, whose right hand doesn't work. Okay, so what does that mean? What is it telling us about Ehud?
He has to use his wit, and I've always been under the impression that left-handed people are creative. And this is an example of that. He had to, I'm not left-handed, so
Okay.
but he couldn't operate under normal circumstances, so he had to figure out how to control a situation with a withered right hand.
Okay, good. Right, but still, that's not taking us as far as saying the significance of him being a Benjaminite. Because left-handed, that would work for whatever tribe he's from. He has to be creative and witty, which yes, but there's still more. Yeah,
Is he
Joe.
an outcast?
Yeah, he seems like he's a misfit, right? Or an outcast. He comes from the tribe of the right hand, and yet his right hand doesn't work.
But he puts his sword on the right side.
So he can draw it with his left hand, right? Like that, okay? So we're told just by the subtle or maybe not so subtle use of language that Ehud is kind of like an outcast or a misfit within the community. And maybe because of that, he's extra witty or he's wily or whatever, but he's not what you would expect from a Benjaminite. We know that much, right? So from the outset, then, it raises the question: why is Ehud the guy that's sent on this mission? Yeah, Terry.
Because he has something to prove. He was different among his own, and he's going to prove that he is just as good as
Maybe
they are.
that's what now the ideological overlay tells us to understand that he's appointed by God. But once you peel back the overlay, that appointment, it doesn't necessarily come that way. In fact, if you look at verse 16, verse 15. Still in verse 15. The Benjaminite, Ehud son of Gera, the left-handed man. It happened that the Israelites sent tribute to King Eglon of Moab for him. So actually, how does Ehud get his commission in the core story? The people sent him. It's not God that sent him. Now, we interpreted that God sent him because that's what the overlay told us, right? They sinned, they were punished when they cried out, God raised up a chieftain. But when you remove that, which is formulaic material, in the core story that we see, he's sent by the community. And what is he sent by the community to do? To give him a tribute. Not to go kill him. To get a tribute. At least that's so far from what the text tells us. We can gather from, or about what Ehud was told to do. So the community sends this guy who is an outcast or a misfit of some kind. They send him on the mission to the foreign king to bring tribute to him. Ehud then kind of goes renegade and decides to kill the guy, right? And how does he kill the guy? Sticking the sword, but he made it. He made his own sword, right? And Joe?
The fact that he was left-handed made it so the king was not on his guard.
Maybe, because he was kind of like a withered up hand. The king wasn't on his guard. And how does he kill him? With the sword. Where does he kill him? In the belly. But where's the king? In the toilet.
Right.
So Ehud goes in there and stabs this king while he's sitting on the toilet at kind of the most vulnerable spot that somebody could be in. Right? And this is Ehud. Now, when you look at the core story, do you read Ehud differently than when you read him through the ideological overlay?
I always wondered where
How
that
so?
name, a lot of people are named Ehud in this.
Like Ehud Barak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now you see.
So from the, I asked you at the outset, how do you understand him from the ideological overlay? He's appointed by God. He's a military. He's a brave leader. He's crafty. He's heroic. Okay. But when you remove the overlay, what is Ehud? How do you describe him? He's sneaky. He's kind of a rogue. He goes on his own. Maybe he's a Jacob. He ambushes the guy. He's not like exactly the epitome of valiance and bravery, attacking the guy while he's sitting on the toilet. Yeah. He's not a military hero. He's kind of a clown. I mean, okay, he is what he is. But now look at the name of the king. So again, I just want you to see the literary nature. So the king is called Eglon. What does that word remind you of in Hebrew? Egel. What is Egel? What is it?
Calf.
The calf. Egel HaZahav is the golden calf. Okay, so an egel is a calf. So the king is called King Calf or Cow.
Well, that's why he's fat.
That's why he's fat, okay? All right, so again, these are like stories, right? King Big Fat Man, was ruling over Israel, and Ehud goes out there and stabs Big King Fat Man while he's sitting on the toilet. Okay, you can see the dark humor in this book.
Oh, really? Is it?
Now, when you don't learn about peeling back and everything, it's like this is kind of the history of Israel. These are the chieftains and they're fighting battles, but it's not that. It's not. I mean, the editor is guiding us in that direction, but there's a lot more to it. So, given the fact that the Israelites sent Ehud on this mission to the foreign king, what kind of message are we getting about the community? They know not what they do. Joan?
I can't help but think about that. If somebody doesn't do something by right, he does it by being sneaky. Because here's that story of this man doing it that way, and it made me think right away of Israel, where he took the birthright away.
Yeah, Philistine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, being
Absolutely.
sneaky.
And David too.
So as a commentary on the community and its state of being during this period, what is Judges telling us about that?
There's a sense of desperation in the community.
Okay, maybe a sense of desperation.
Where you have to take things in your own hands if you want things to get done.
Well, maybe. I guess the question that I want to ask about that is are we meant to perceive Ehud as as a paradigm of good leadership.
No, there's another reason for the king,
Right.
the need of a monarch.
Yeah, right?
Monarch.
It's like on the one hand, the writer is telling us this is how history works, God appointed him, da, da, da. At the same time, when you start peeling it back and you see it's more subtle than that. That the editor is telling us at once, yeah, he's appointed by God, he's the leader of the community, and at the same time, this guy is a clown. And the community who puts their trust in him are like foolish. This is painting a really kind of not so favorable picture of the Israelite community and their leaders. Again, helping to make the strong case for why we need a king. It's all happening at the same time, right? So it's complex literature in that respect. Jen?
And then the next person who's supposed to deliver them is just sort of dismissed.
Yeah, he's just a little short story about Shamgar. The next one, so we don't have a lot of time. So I think what we should probably stop here. We can talk about some questions, and then on our next session we'll pick up with another story. We'll see how many we can do. I want to do the next story is about Deborah and Barak. Marilyn.
I'm feeling really uncomfortable in this, in scene one, why we don't know Judges, why it's not part of the liturgy. And also, in light of anti-Semitism in the world, this is not a very nice picture.
Yeah.
That's just my reaction to it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Ehud is not. He's definitely not the kind of paragon of bravery and valiance in battle.
Who was the Ehud in Israeli politics? Is there one?
Ehud Barak. He was the prime minister for a while. He was the defense
He's in
minister.
trouble.
Yeah, but it's kind of funny, you know, when you go back and read
Yeah,
Judges.
right.
Ehud, Ehud is not.
Paradigm.
Like, he's not like a model of bravery and military might, military strength.
Militarily, he was a good leader, but once he got out of the military, he started dabbling in.
Barak, yeah, Ehud Barak.
Yeah, Ehud Barak.
Yeah, so his namesake.
Yeah.
Here we go, here he is.
Left-handed was sort of bad in biblical times, right, anyway, right?
I don't know. I mean, maybe, but left-handed is a little bit of it misses some of the boat, because it's not that he's left-handed, it's just that his right hand is withered up. He may be right-handed. It's just that his right hand doesn't work. So he has no choice but to use his left hand. That doesn't mean it's a strong hand. So he's a misfit. He's not the full kind of package of might and strength and cunning. He has to, like, he's wily, and he has to kind of, you know, being the outcast, he has to do things differently, or he does things differently. But he kind of just goes off on his own. The community sends him on a job, and he's like, and he attacks the guy in the toilet. That's not why they sent him.
You know, the left-handed is sinister, means left-handed in
Yeah.
Latin.
Right.
So there's that, no, not right, but.
Yeah, incorrect.
What is the city of Palms?
I don't
Did
know.
we,
Let's
I
see.
didn't read that before.
Jericho, it's Jericho.
Jericho?
Jericho.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's year on to Marie.
Where is it?
It's in verse 13.
Verse 13, occupied the city.
I have Jericho in parentheses,
Okay.
after city of Palms.
Okay.
City of Date Palms, parentheses, Jericho.
Okay. Yeah, so look, this is just the beginning of Judges.
Yeah.
I mean, Judges, it goes, we obviously aren't going to be able to do anywhere close to the whole book. We'll do definitely one more story, maybe two more stories. But this is just getting started. I mean, this book goes way dark. It gets real dark and really weird, and some of the stories are just, it's like, I mean, it's an interesting book for that reason, because in addition just to the weird stories that it tells, now you have a sense of all this stuff that's going on in terms of the writer's agenda and creating a community, what his vision is for the Israelite community. And it's a very stinging critique of the Israelite community. This book. Yeah. So maybe you look at it in between the time we're meeting again in 2 weeks. Look at it; you'll just see how dark it is.
Is Rabbi Shapiro sick?
No, he just wasn't able to teach.
Right.
Yeah.
I always understood the book of Judges being written by the monarchy, written by the southern kingdom. And this is a polemic against the north.
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know enough about it to say. But it's neat that the
There's some match.
maybe. Yeah, it's neat too that, apropos of Marilyn's comment, that the Bible contains all this different kind of literature within it. I mean, it represents different viewpoints. It represents internal politics and critique, and internal battles for primacy and territory and different views about God, different views about the world. It's all compiled together into this book. That's, one of the things that makes the Bible such an amazing book. But we miss a lot of the literature just because we don't read it. So we might just think that the Bible is just kind of about be a good person and a moral person. It's not. It's about a lot more than that. Which makes it so interesting just to study. Okay. All right.